Acts chapter 27. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. So this is continuing Paul's trial that he has been facing since Jerusalem and in Judea and in Caesarea under two governors, Felix and Festus. Festus was wanting to send him to face trial in Jerusalem to the Jews, but they would have just killed him. And so Paul appealed to Caesar in Rome, and this was actually a part of God's plan to take the gospel through Paul to Rome, and even before the emperor, Caesar. And so now Paul has been sent from Caesarea on a ship to Rome, and he has been placed in the charge of Julius, a centurion of the Augustan cohort. So this could be 100 or even more soldiers who have been tasked with securely taking Paul all the way to Rome to present him before Caesar. And this is quite incredible. Verse 2, and embarking in a ship from Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. So it seems like they're not taking Roman ships, they're taking commercial boats and whatever route they can find that will take them to Rome. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. So Paul is a Roman citizen. He hasn't been found guilty, so he's been treated with kindness, fairly. He wouldn't have been treated like other prisoners who are not Roman citizens. He was basically being escorted to Rome by these soldiers. And so they had a duty to keep him in custody, but they wouldn't treat him illegally because he was a Roman citizen. So he was even allowed in Sidon to walk around quite freely and go and visit his friends and be cared for by his friends. Verse 4, and putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. So the course that ships would take was very often determined by the winds. Certain winds would prevent them from taking a certain course, and so they would use some of the large islands to sail around the protected side of them. And so instead of going on the south side of the island, which probably would have been quicker to get to their destination, they journeyed up around the north side of Cyprus to seek shelter from the wind. Verse 5, and when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. Then the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. So you can see it's not Roman ships, it's just commercial ships, and he's found a suitable one. Winter is actually approaching, so they're trying to get to Rome before winter comes because the seas would be treacherous in winter, strong winds, cold would prevent them. If winter hit before they could get to Rome, then they'd be stuck in some location or harbor for the whole winter. Verse 7, we sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete of Salmone. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lycia. Verse 9, since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over. So what does that mean? Has that got some spiritual implication? No, it's talking about the fast, which is the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Atonement. And this is actually showing us that winter is approaching because the Feast of Atonement took place in the autumn, which was just before winter. And so they had a long stretch of sea to cover between Crete and Italy. And so if they're still in the middle of it, by the time winter hit, they would be in lots of danger. And so basically it's saying that they're running out of time. To make it safely to Italy, they might have to spend somewhere safe for the winter. So the fast was already over, winter was approaching. Paul advised them, saying, sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. So Paul at that point would have been speaking spiritually, picking up in God what would happen, but he wasn't the captain of a ship. He was just the prisoner, so why listen to him? And so they didn't pay any attention to him. Verse 12, and because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So obviously this region was used to getting strong winds from the southwest and the northwest. And so instead of staying where they were, as Paul was advising, they decided to try to head around the island to the west side of Crete to Phoenix and station there for the winter. But as we see, they probably should have listened to Paul. Verse 13, now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. And so the strong northeaster was actually blowing them away from where they were trying to get. And when they saw it was going to be impossible, they just gave way to the wind and let it take them along. And it says that they were driven along. Verse 16, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. That's the lifeboat. Perhaps it was trailing behind them, and so they were trying to get it in so that it didn't get smashed up. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. That's just throwing it overboard. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So it's starting to get more desperate every day. Every day they're trying to save less and less of the boat, and it becomes more about saving their lives. Verse 20, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. So a very dire situation. They caught out at sea, days on end, massive storm, would have been strong winds, large waves crashing overboard. They'd thrown as many things overboard, most likely to make the ship more buoyant, but now they had lost hope that even they were going to survive. Terrible situation that Paul finds himself in. It seems to be the story of his life. Verse 21, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Wow, in the middle of that situation, Paul's like, I told you so, you should have listened to me. But I believe he's saying that because he wants to instruct them now and he needs them to listen to him now. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. And so that is a great promise from God that none of them are going to die. You're going to lose the ship, but at least none of you are going to die. And so he was able to encourage them with these words and perhaps muster up enough energy out of them to prepare them to run aground and then swim for shore. Verse 27, when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, they had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and soldiers, unless these men stay on the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. This just shows you how intense the storm was, that for 14 days no one had eaten anything. They'd lost all appetite. And so what a wild storm. And here Paul is encouraging them to eat. He's getting them ready for this final little surge to save their lives. Verse 34, therefore I urge you to take some food, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. There were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. So that then actually was the final thing that was thrown into the sea. This would have been a cargo ship carrying grain or wheat to Italy. And so that was the final thing to go. Now they are just trying to save their lives. Verse 39, now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. So now they stuck on a reef just offshore. It must have been big waves from the storm, and it's smashing the back of the boat. No doubt the boat is beginning to break apart now. Verse 42, the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to the land. And so that was an incredible storm. It's destroyed their ship. They've almost died, but they've just survived. They've washed up on some island, and some terrible things have happened. And you can ask, where is God in all of this? And actually, God was right there in the middle of all of it, bringing wisdom to Paul, bringing comfort to Paul, bringing strategy. And they've actually now landed on the island of Malta. And God actually does some phenomenal things through Paul on the island of Malta, where there's lots of miracles and people getting saved. And Paul preaches the gospel to the top leader in Malta. And you could ask, why was God allowing these terrible things to happen? Well, God wasn't making them happen. It wasn't his will or purpose for them to happen. But God actually used all of this to reach more people with the gospel. And I just think that there is something in this that we can learn from, so that we can actually think better when we face different circumstances, and we can actually have a heavenly kingdom perspective in our circumstances. This was a terrible storm that Paul found himself in, and yet through all of this, God's will was unfolding. And because Paul was responding to God and obeying God and walking in the Spirit, many amazing things happened. Paul didn't give up hope. Paul didn't get disillusioned in the middle of the storm. Paul didn't reject God, turn his back on God, abandon his faith. No, the storm actually caused Paul to get a hold of God. And in the middle of this incredibly difficult time, some amazing things happened. And so Paul's journey from Jerusalem to Rome has been a long journey. It's taken a number of years. It's been a dangerous journey. Paul's nearly lost his life a number of times. But you can just see through all of it the mighty hand of God upon Paul. And Paul's just responding to God and preaching the gospel at every opportunity he gets. And Rome can wait a little bit longer. Before he gets to Rome, the island of Malta gets to hear the gospel.